Imagine writing letters so bold, so commanding, that people are intimidated just reading your words, and then showing up in person and having people say, "That's it? This is the guy?" That's exactly what was being said about Paul. His enemies in Corinth had a plan. Undercut him, make him look like a fraud, say his letters are all bark and no bite. And in this chapter, Paul doesn't get defensive. He does something a lot more interesting. He tells them what kind of fight they're actually in. Stick around, because by the end of this one, Paul names a weapon that has nothing to do with being impressive and everything to do with being right. We're in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Quick context, Paul planted the church in Corinth. He loves these people. But after he left, rival teachers showed up. Polished speakers, confident, charismatic voices. They started chipping away at Paul's credibility behind his back. Their pitch to the Corinthians was basically, Paul's letters are strong, sure, but the man himself, not so much. So as chapter 10 opens, Paul addresses that accusation head on. He starts in a place no one ever expected: gentleness. Now I, Paul, myself, entreat you by the humility and gentleness of Christ. I who in your presence am lowly among you, but being absent am bold toward you. Yes, I beg you that I may not, when present, show courage with the confidence with which I intend to be bold against some, who consider us to be walking according to the flesh. Paul opens by appealing to the humility and gentleness of Christ. Then he basically warns the Corinthians, don't make me prove how bold I can be when I show up. Paul isn't denying the accusation. He doesn't argue. Actually, I'm very impressive in person. Instead, he points somewhere entirely else, to Christ, who was humble and gentle, but still wasn't weak. Christ humbled himself all the way to death on a cross, and that humility was the furthest thing from weakness. It was strength under total control. This is the whole key to the chapter. Paul is saying, you're measuring me by the wrong scale. Loud and forceful isn't the same thing as strong, and meek isn't the same as soft. St. Augustine, a man who spent years chasing status, applause, and his own reputation before his conversion, came to the opposite conclusion by hard-earned experience. Asked once to name the most important virtue, he reportedly answered simply, humility, humility, and humility. And that's basically Paul's whole opening argument in one line. But here's the thing, Paul isn't just being nice about it. He says he's fully ready to be bold when he arrives. Against the people stirring this up, gentle does not mean he's a pushover. Keep that tension in mind because it's about to get a lot more intense. So if Paul's gentleness isn't weakness, what is his strength actually made of? Well, he's about to tell us. And it's not what his critics expected either. For though we walk in the flesh, we don't wage war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but mighty before God to the throwing down of strongholds, throwing down imaginations and every high thing that is exalted against the knowledge of God, and bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ, and being in readiness to avenge all disobedience when your obedience is made full. Paul admits that he's still human. We walk in the flesh, but insists he's not fighting with the flesh. His weapons aren't physical, they're weapons with divine power, strong enough to tear down strongholds and take every thought captive. Paul is reframing the whole conflict. His rivals think they're in a popularity contest. Who's the better speaker? Who's more commanding in a room? Paul says no, this is actually a war, but not the kind you're picturing. It's a fight over what people actually believe is true. The strongholds aren't buildings, they're false arguments and prideful reasoning that get built up against real knowledge of God. And Paul's weapons? Truth, the gospel, the authority Christ gave him can knock all of that down. This is where a really relevant piece of church teaching fits in. The Catechism describes the whole of human history in exactly these terms. as an ongoing spiritual battle. As it puts it, our story has been the story of dour combat with the powers of evil, stretching from the beginning of history to the end. Paul isn't using dramatic language for effect. He genuinely believes, and the church has always taught, that this is a real spiritual conflict, not just an argument between rival preachers. We'll come back to that idea of authority in just a minute, because next Paul explains exactly where his authority actually comes from. Paul just made a big claim: divine power, strongholds torn down, thoughts taken captive. So is he all talk? He answers that next, and it gets personal. Do you look at things only as they appear in front of your face? If anyone trusts in himself that he is Christ's, let him consider this again with himself, that even as he is Christ's, so we also are Christ's. For even if I boast somewhat abundantly concerning our authority, which the Lord gave for building you up and not for casting you down, I will not be ashamed, that I may not seem as if I desire to terrify you by my letters. For his letters, they say, are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech is despised. Let such a person consider this, that what we are in word by letters when we are absent, such are we also in deed when we are present. Paul quotes his critics almost word for word. His letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and then tells the Corinthians to stop judging only as they appear in front of your face. He insists that what he writes, he will absolutely follow through on in person. Paul's making a simple but pointed claim. He's not two different people. The bold letter writer and the man who shows up are the same guy. And notice why he says he has authority in the first place. It's not self-appointed. He says it plainly. He belongs to Christ, and so his authority is for building you up, not casting you down. That's not the profile of someone trying to run a con. This is really a practical test. Honestly, not just for Paul, but for anyone claiming spiritual authority. Does their private life match their public words? Paul says his does, and he's willing to be held to it. But here's the thing. Paul could have just proven this by showing up and being intimidating. Instead, in the next section, he tells us exactly why he refuses to do that. You'd think after all this, Paul would want to win the popularity contest with false teachers, once and for all. He does the opposite. For we are not bold to number or compare ourselves with some of those who commend themselves, but they themselves, measuring themselves by themselves, and comparing themselves with themselves, are without understanding. But we will not boast beyond proper limits, but within the boundaries with which God appointed to us, which reach even to you. For we don't stretch ourselves too much, as though we didn't reach to you. For we came even as far as to you with the good news of Christ, not boasting beyond proper limits in other men's labors, but having hope that as your faith grows, we will be abundantly enlarged by you in our sphere of influence, so as to preach the good news even to the parts beyond you, not to boast in what someone else has already done. Paul refuses to rank himself against the rival teachers, and he calls out what they're doing, measuring themselves by themselves, comparing themselves with themselves. He says that's actually a sign of no understanding at all. Think about what that comparison trap looks like, a closed loop where you only measure your worth against people you've picked to look good next to. Paul won't do it. His mission was never to win a following for himself. It was to bring people to Christ. And he already did that in Corinth. Now his hope is simply to keep expanding the gospel further, not to relegate his own reputation. This is such a relevant snapshot of pride's favorite move, comparison. It always needs a rigid scoreboard to feel good about itself. Paul steps completely outside the game. He's not competing for the Corinthians' admiration. He already has something better, the fact that he's the one who brought them the gospel in the first place. So if Paul won't boast in himself, and he won't boast by comparison, what's actually left to boast in? And he answers that in the final 2 verses of the chapter. But he who boasts, let him boast in the Lord. For it isn't he who commends himself who is approved, but whom the Lord commends. Paul closes out the chapter with a sharp line, quoting the prophet Jeremiah, that if you're going to boast about anything, boast in the Lord, because self-commendation means nothing. Only the Lord's approval counts. This is the punchline for the whole chapter. Every argument Paul made about gentleness not being weakness, about spiritual weapons, about matching his letters to his life, about refusing to compare himself to rivals, all of it lands here. Paul isn't trying to win the Corinthians' approval rating. He already has the only approval that actually matters. The Corinthians of all people should have known this. They came to faith because of Paul's ministry. If anyone had the Lord's approval on him, it was Paul. And he knew it didn't need defending with any sort of performance. So let's pull it all together. Paul's critics accused him of being all talk, strong letters, weak presence. Instead of defending his image, Paul redirects the whole conversation to the gentleness of Christ, to spiritual weapons stronger than argument, to a life that matches his words, and finally to the only approval worth chasing, the Lord's. Here's our question for the day. Where in your life are you tempted to measure yourself against someone else's scoreboard, instead of asking what God actually thinks of you? If this kind of verse-by-verse breakdown helps you actually get the scripture instead of just skimming it, go ahead and subscribe. We're working through the New Testament chapter by chapter. Drop a comment and let me know what stood out to you in this one. And next time, we're in 2 Corinthians 11, where Paul gets even more direct about what he's endured to preach the gospel. I'll see you there.